September 19th, 1931. A single gunshot echoes through a luxurious Munich apartment. The sound is swallowed by heavy drapes and expensive rugs. The official story will be suicide. A young woman, overcome with despair. But the first people on the scene are not the police. They are not doctors. They are the future leaders of the Third Reich, men who understand power, secrets, and the art of the cover-up. What were they so desperate to hide? To find the answer, we have to go back, before the gunshot, before the whispers and the lies, to meet the girl in the golden cage. Her name was Geli Raubal. You've probably never heard of her. History has a way of burying its inconvenient truths. But for a time, she was the sun around which a dark star orbited. Geli was Adolf Hitler's half-niece. She arrived in Munich in 1925, a bright, vivacious teenager with dreams of becoming an opera singer. Her mother, Hitler's half-sister, had become his housekeeper, and Geli became his obsession. In public, he was Uncle Alf, the doting, generous guardian. He moved her into his sprawling 9-room apartment at Prinzregentenplatz 16, an address of prestige, of rising power. It was a palace for a young girl from the provinces. Imagine the scene. Munich in the late 1920s, a city buzzing with art, politics, and danger. And at the center of it all, this strange pair, the charismatic, increasingly powerful politician and the beautiful young woman always on his arm. He took her everywhere, to the opera, to chic cafes, to party meetings. He showed her off like a prized possession. To his followers, she was a symbol of his softer side, proof that the fiery orator had a heart, a family to care for. Look at the photographs from that time. You see them smiling. Geli, with a look of youthful confidence. Hitler, beaming with a possessive pride. He bought her the latest fashions, paid for her singing lessons, surrounded her with a luxury she had never known. He was creating his perfect companion. He once told a colleague, "I can have a conversation with Geli about music, while my party comrades can only talk about sausage." She was his escape, his cultural ideal. The inner circle of the Nazi Party watched this unfold. They saw how his mood depended on hers. If Geli was happy, Hitler was approachable. If she was distant, he was a storm cloud of fury. They called her the princess. She could charm anyone. She was witty. She was flirtatious. Young men in the party flocked to her, and Hitler watched them all. His gaze followed her across every crowded room. It wasn't the protective glance of an uncle. It was the look of a jailer. The apartment at Prinzregentenplatz was her world. She had beautiful clothes, fine food, a grand piano. But the doors were locked from the outside. She couldn't go shopping without a chaperone. She couldn't meet friends without his permission. Every letter she received, every phone call she made, was monitored. The golden cage had bars, even if they were invisible to the outside world. Her dream of studying music in Vienna, of having her own life, became a forbidden topic. Every time she mentioned it, his face would darken. Vienna was freedom, and freedom was the one thing he would never allow her. One afternoon, the mail arrives, a stack of letters and party correspondence for Hitler, and among them, a single small envelope. The handwriting is not political, it's personal, it's addressed to Geli. Hitler picks it up. He holds it for a moment, weighing it in his hand. He could place it on the hall table for her to find. That is what an uncle would do. But he doesn't. He walks into his private study. The room is immaculate, orderly. He sits at his large wooden desk. He looks at the envelope again. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he slides a letter opener under the seal and opens it. His eyes scan the page. The letter is from a friend, a man in Vienna. It speaks of a future Geli desperately wants. A life away from Munich, away from him. As Hitler reads, his posture changes. His shoulders stiffen. The muscles in his jaw tighten into knots. The benevolent Uncle Alf vanishes. In his place is something cold and hard. The doting guardian becomes a prosecutor, reading evidence of a betrayal. The letter is a plan for escape. It is a symbol of her defiance. And in his world, defiance was a crime that required punishment. He carefully folds the letter, places it back in the envelope, and sets it on his desk. He does not reseal it. He wants her to know. He wants her to know that there are no secrets, that he sees everything. The fairy tale was over. The illusion was shattered. She wasn't his beloved niece. She was his prisoner. If Hitler adored her so much, why was he reading her private mail? Geli Raubal had a plan to escape. She had a destination, a dream, and a secret love interest. But her warden was one of the most obsessive men in history, and he was never going to let her go. The public saw the charming niece and her doting Uncle Alf. They saw trips to the opera, laughter in expensive cafes, the very picture of a happy family. But inside the walls of the sprawling 9-room apartment at Prinzregentenplatz 16, the air was different. It was heavy with unspoken rules and the constant weight of his presence. Geli smiled for the cameras, but behind her eyes a different story was unfolding. A story of a gilded cage whose bars were growing tighter every day. Her dream had a name, Vienna. For Geli, Vienna wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. It was the place where she could finally breathe. She was a talented singer, and Vienna was the capital of music. It held the promise of lessons with the best tutors, of a stage, of a life that was hers and hers alone. In Munich, she was an accessory, a beautiful object her uncle displayed to soften his public image. In Vienna, she could be an artist. She could be herself. She began to meet with friends in secret. These weren't grand conspiracies, just hushed conversations over coffee, snatched moments of freedom in crowded public spaces. She would lean in close, her voice a near whisper, her eyes scanning the room. She told them she felt suffocated. She described how her uncle would question her about every minute she was away, every person she spoke to. He went through her mail, listened in on her phone calls. He wasn't her guardian. He was her jailer. And there was another reason for Vienna, a secret she held even closer. A man from her past, a friend from her hometown of Linz. He was waiting for her there. Their correspondence was careful, coded, but the affection was real. He represented a normal life, a romance that wasn't tainted by power and obsession. He was her private hope, a future completely separate from the suffocating world of Adolf Hitler. Her uncle, however, had an almost animal-like sense for any threat to his control. He couldn't read her mind, but he could read her behavior. He saw the flicker of defiance in her eyes, the yearning for something beyond his reach. And so he tightened his grip. Geli had enrolled in art lessons, a small act of independence. But when Hitler learned the class involved drawing a nude male model, he exploded in a fit of rage. He forbade her from ever returning. The idea of a gaze resting on another man's body, even in a purely artistic context, was unbearable to him. Her world was to be filled only with him. The paranoia extended to everyone around her. A chauffeur was dismissed without warning. His crime? He had been too friendly with Geli. They had shared a laugh in the hallway. Hitler saw this not as innocent human interaction, but as a breach, a potential line of communication to the outside world that he did not control. The message was brutally clear. Anyone who got too close to Geli, anyone who offered her a moment of unmonitored companionship, would be removed. He was systematically isolating her, cutting every thread that connected her to a life outside his own. Imagine the tension in that apartment, the silence at the dinner table, thick with resentment. Every request she made was a battle. Every desire for freedom was met with a wall of possessiveness. Geli was not a passive victim. She fought back. She argued. She pleaded. The dream of Vienna became her singular focus. It was no longer just a desire. It was a necessity. Her sanity depended on it. Their arguments always circled back to the same subject, Vienna. She wanted to go. He refused. He'd list his reasons, all cloaked in paternal concern. The world was dangerous. He was the only one who could protect her. But beneath the excuses was the raw truth of his obsession. He could not stand the thought of her building a life where he was not the absolute center. Then, one evening, after a particularly bitter fight, the shouting from his study finally stopped. Geli, exhausted and tearful, made her case one last time. She was not a child. She needed a career. She needed to live. And then the unthinkable happened. His voice was quiet, his tone begrudging, but the words were unmistakable. He agreed. He would let her go to Vienna. A wave of pure relief washed over her. It was a victory she thought she would never achieve. The cage door had finally swung open. That night, she sat down and wrote a joyful, triumphant letter to a friend. Freedom, she wrote, was just around the corner. She was packing her bags, planning her future. The nightmare in Munich was over. Vienna and her new life awaited. You can almost feel her hope lifting off the page, the breathless excitement of a prisoner about to be set free. She believed him. She sealed the letter, her heart soaring with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Her uncle had finally listened. He had finally understood. But as she slept that night, dreaming of concert halls and a future filled with music and light, a cold question hung in the silent apartment. Had Hitler really changed his mind? Or was this just a calculated deception to placate her? The night before her death, Geli Raubal had one final explosive confrontation with Hitler. Neighbors heard shouting through the thick walls of the luxury apartment building. They heard a woman's voice, pleading, then defiant. They heard her cry, "No!" The next morning, she was found dead. This is the story of her last hours. The evening of September 18th, 1931, began with a heavy silence. The air in the grand Munich apartment on Prinzregentenplatz was thick with unspoken tension. Adolf Hitler was preparing to leave for a crucial campaign rally in Hamburg. He moved with a brisk, impatient energy, packing papers into a leather briefcase. Every snap of a latch echoed in the cavernous rooms. Geli watched him from the doorway of his study. She had spent the day gathering her courage. This was it. No more waiting, no more deferring her life for his political schedule. She stepped into the room. "Uncle Alf?" she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to talk before you go." He didn't look up. "I'm busy, Geli. We can speak when I return." His tone was dismissive, the tone one uses for a child. But she wasn't a child anymore. She was 23. "No, it has to be now. I'm leaving for Vienna." That made him stop. He slowly straightened, his eyes fixing on her with a look that could chill the warmest room. "We have discussed this," he said, each word a carefully placed stone. "The matter is closed. You are not going to Vienna." "The matter is not closed for me," she countered, her voice rising. "My life is in Vienna. My singing lessons, my friends, my future." The argument spilled out of the study and into the main living area, a vast space filled with heavy furniture and portraits that seemed to watch them. She followed him as he paced, his steps thudding on the thick Persian rugs. "You can't keep me here forever." A strange, cold smile touched his lips. "Can't I?" he said softly. "You live under my roof. You eat my food, your beautiful clothes, your trips to the opera. Who provides all of that, Geli?" He was closing the trap, reminding her of her dependence. But desperation had made her bold. "I don't care about the clothes. I want to live my own life." Then his demeanor shifted. The cold control vanished, replaced by a sudden, volcanic rage. He strode to a writing desk and pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a letter, her letter, one she had written in secret. "Your life?" he spat. "You mean your life with him? This music teacher you write to? You think I am a fool?" The color drained from her face. He knew. He had been intercepting her mail, violating her last piece of privacy. He held the letter up, his hand shaking with fury. "My dearest," he read, mocking her words. "Soon we will be together, away from all of this." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "You think you can run away from me to be with another man? You think I would allow that?" Panic set in. She saw her chance for freedom not just denied, but twisted into a sordid betrayal. She had to get help. She turned and ran for the hallway, for the black telephone resting on its small table. It was her only link to the outside world. He was faster. He moved with a predator's speed, blocking her path. He grabbed the telephone first, but he didn't just stop her from using it. With a violent jerk, he ripped the entire cord from the wall. The plastic cracked. The connection was severed. "You will call no one," he hissed, his face inches from hers. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like a vice. This wasn't her Uncle Alf anymore. This was her jailer. She struggled against his grip, but it was useless. "Let go of me!" He dragged her away from the useless phone back towards the apartment's main entrance. His words were no longer a shout, but a terrifying, possessive whisper. "You belong to me. Do you understand? You are my property. You will stay here until you learn to be grateful, until you learn obedience." He backed her against the heavy front door, trapping her. He reached past her and took the key from the inside lock. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He opened the door, the cool air from the hallway washing over them for a moment. He looked at her one last time, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Then he stepped out. She heard the click of the lock, then the loud final sound of the deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. Silence. He was gone, and she was locked in. For a moment, she simply stood there, stunned. Then a wave of pure terror crashed over her. She threw herself against the solid oak door, beating on it with her fists. "Let me out! Let me out!" Her voice was raw, desperate. There was no answer, only the mocking silence of the empty apartment. She stumbled through the rooms, a prisoner in her own gilded cage. She ran to the windows, pulling at the heavy latches. They were sealed tight. The beautiful apartment, once a symbol of his generosity, now felt like a tomb. Every expensive object, every piece of art, seemed to mock her. She collapsed onto the floor, her body racked with sobs. Every escape route was cut off. Every line of communication was severed. The dream of Vienna, of a life of her own, was not just delayed, it was dead. As she sat there, broken on the floor, her tear-filled eyes drifted across the room. They came to rest on his study, on the polished, dark wood of his writing desk. Her gaze fixed on one spot, the top drawer on the right-hand side, the one he always kept locked, the one she knew from a careless remark he'd once made, where he kept his Walter pistol. When Geli Raubal's body was found, the first call was not to the police. It was to the Nazi Party headquarters. By the time investigators arrived, the scene was already compromised. The cover-up had begun. The morning of September 19th, 1931. The luxurious apartment at Prinzregentenplatz 16 is silent. A heavy, unnatural silence that feels out of place in the grand, sunlit rooms. The housekeeper, Anne Winter, goes about her morning routine. She prepares coffee. She tidies the living room, a space that only hours before had echoed with shouting. She approaches Geli's door and knocks softly. No answer. She knocks again, a little louder this time. "Geli, are you awake?" Still, only silence responds from behind the heavy oak door. Annie feels a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This isn't right. After the terrible argument the night before, after Hitler had stormed out, Geli had been inconsolable. Annie tries the doorknob. It's locked from the inside. Panic begins to prickle at the edges of her composure. She calls Geli's name again, her voice now sharp with fear. The silence that answers is absolute. Annie knows she cannot force the door herself. She also knows who not to call. The police would bring reporters. Scandal, questions her employer would never forgive. Her loyalty is to one man. But that man is hundreds of kilometers away, on his way to a rally in Hamburg. Her instructions in any crisis are clear. She hurries to the telephone, her hands trembling as she dials the number for the Brown House, the Nazi Party headquarters. She asks for Rudolf Hess, Hitler's devoted deputy. The men who arrive within the hour are not detectives. They are not paramedics. They are party men, dressed in sharp suits, their faces grim and purposeful. Rudolf Hess is there, his expression unreadable. With him is the party's top lawyer, Hans Frank. They are not here to offer condolences. They are here to perform damage control. They listen to the housekeeper's frantic explanation, then turn their attention to the locked door. There is no time to wait for a locksmith, no desire for outside witnesses. One of the men, a burly stormtrooper acting as a bodyguard, puts his shoulder to the door. The wood groans. He tries again. A sharp crack echoes through the apartment as the lock splinters and the door swings inward. For a moment, they all freeze in the doorway. The room is immaculate. Sunlight streams through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. On the floor, lying on a fine oriental rug near a chaise lounge, is Geli Raubal. She is dressed in a simple blue and white dirndl. Her eyes are closed. Sprawled near her outstretched right hand is a small pistol. A dark stain is spreading across the front of her dress just over her heart. On a small desk by the window, there is a letter. It's half finished. Rudolf Hess moves first. His steps are measured, deliberate. He walks past the body, his eyes fixed on that piece of paper. He picks it up, folds it, and puts it in his inside jacket pocket. He doesn't read it aloud. No one asks him to. Hans Frank begins speaking in a low, authoritative voice, issuing orders. Secure the apartment. Let no one else in. Keep the housekeeper quiet. Every action is precise. Every move is calculated. They are not preserving a crime scene. They are sanitizing it. Only after the letter is gone, after the room has been assessed by party eyes, is the call finally placed to the Munich police. When Chief Inspector Heinrich Müller and his team arrive, they walk into a scene that feels wrong. The apartment is filled with imposing men in suits who watch their every move. Rudolf Hess greets them at the door, his manner polite but firm. He explains the situation, a terrible tragedy. The young woman, Hitler's beloved niece, was prone to bouts of depression. She was upset about a canceled trip to Vienna. In a moment of despair, she took her own life. The story is neat, tidy, and delivered before a single question has been asked. The detectives enter Geli's room. The body has not been moved, but the atmosphere is sterile, controlled. Müller begins his work, trying to ignore the hostile stares of the political figures lining the walls. He notes the position of the body. He notes the location of the weapon, a Walther 6.35 millimeter pistol. He asks whose gun it is. After a brief, tense silence, someone admits it belongs to Hitler. He kept it in his bedside table for protection. Müller kneels down to get a closer look. Something immediately strikes him as odd. The pistol is lying near Geli's hand, almost touching her fingertips. But her fingers are relaxed, slightly curled. It doesn't look like the hand of someone who just fired a weapon, a hand that should be clenched in a death grip from the recoil and the final spasm. It looks placed, as if it were gently set there after the fact. He pushes the thought aside for a moment and continues his examination. The entry wound is in her chest, consistent with a self-inflicted shot aimed at the heart. But his eyes are drawn to her face. Geli's face, famous in their circle for its beauty and vibrancy, is pale and still. But there's something else. On the bridge of her nose, almost hidden in the shadow, is a faint, purplish discoloration, a bruise. He leans in closer, his professional instincts overriding the political pressure in the room. He gently touches the area. The underlying bone feels slightly out of place. It looks like her nose is broken. A broken nose! The official story is suicide, a single gunshot, a clean, tragic, self-contained event. But a broken nose doesn't come from a bullet to the chest. It comes from a fist. It comes from a violent struggle. It tells a completely different story. And in that silent, controlled room, surrounded by men determined to sell a simple tragedy, that small, overlooked detail screams of a much darker truth. The official story was already falling apart. There was the delay in calling the police, the missing letter, and the simple fact that the men controlling the scene were the ones with everything to lose. The inspector stands up, his face a mask of neutrality. He knows what he has seen. He also knows who he is up against. The official report will mention the gunshot. It will mention the locked door. It will mention the story of a heartbroken young woman. But the real question, the one that could bring down a rising political movement, hangs unspoken in the air. Why would a woman who shot herself in the chest also have a broken nose? In any investigation, the timeline is the backbone. It's the one thing that has to hold up. But in the case of Geli Raubal, the backbone was shattered from the start. Every witness told a different story. Every alibi had a crack. And Adolf Hitler's own account of where he was, it kept changing. The truth wasn't just hidden. It was being actively dismantled hour by hour right in front of the Munich police. The detectives, led by a seasoned investigator named Georg Reichel, were professionals. They were used to lies and they were used to grief. But they had never walked into a crime scene quite like Prinzregentenplatz 16. The body was gone. The room felt scrubbed clean, not by forensics, but by politics. And the men in crisp party uniforms who watched their every move weren't mourners. They were guards, guards of a secret. The first interviews began with the Reichert family, the neighbors who lived directly below Hitler's apartment. They were hesitant to speak. You learned quickly in 1931 Munich that some doors were best left unopened, but they had heard things. They couldn't deny it. They told police about the shouting match on Friday afternoon. They described a man's voice roaring with fury and a woman's voice pleading, then defiant. They heard the words Vienna and never. The argument was violent, terrifying. It wasn't the first time they had heard fights from upstairs, but this one was different. This one had a finality to it. Then, the crucial question, when did they hear the shot? Here, the stories began to fray. Frau Reichert thought she heard a dull thud late in the afternoon. Her husband disagreed, thinking it was later, perhaps in the evening. They couldn't be sure. The sounds of the city could play tricks on you. But one thing was certain. After the final desperate shouts, there was only silence, a heavy, unnatural silence that lasted all night. Next, the police spoke with the housekeeper, Annie Winter. She was the one who found Geli, and she was distraught, her face pale, her hands trembling. Her initial statement was clear, almost rehearsed. She'd heard the argument. She'd seen Herr Hitler leave in a rage, heading to Hamburg for a rally. He slammed the door behind him. Geli was locked in her room, and wouldn't answer when called for dinner. The next morning, when the door was still locked, Annie panicked and called for help. The detectives pressed her on the timing. Did she hear a gunshot? At first, she was adamant. She heard nothing at all. But under pressure, her story shifted. She admitted she might have heard a sound, a pop, like a car backfiring on the street below. It happened around 3 or 4 in the afternoon on Friday, long before Hitler's car would have even cleared the city limits. This was the first solid piece of the timeline. A shot fired when Adolf Hitler was still in Munich. Then, the man himself arrived. Hitler had been called back from the road, his motorcade screaming through the night. The detectives watched as he entered. His face was a mask of theatrical agony. He didn't walk. He staggered. He collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands, wailing about his angel, his dearest Geli. He spoke of her as a martyr, a pure soul destroyed by cruel rumors, painting himself as the heartbroken guardian, the victim of a terrible tragedy. The investigators exchanged glances. They had seen real grief. They had sat with parents who had lost children, with husbands who had lost wives. Real grief was a quiet, hollow thing. This was not that. This was loud. This was a performance. It was an opera of sorrow, staged for an audience. They asked for his alibi. He was on the road to Nuremberg, he insisted, to catch a flight. He had left Munich around 2 in the afternoon. His driver, Julius Schreck, and his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, could confirm it. They were with him the entire time. He was miles away when it happened. His alibi seemed solid, backed by loyal men who would never betray him. But it directly contradicted the housekeeper's timeline. 2 stories. Both couldn't be true. The investigation was at a critical point. The police had a timeline that placed Hitler in the city when the shot was fired. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was political dynamite. The leader of the Nazi Party, a man who preached discipline and moral purity, embroiled in a violent domestic dispute that ended in death. The scandal would have been career-ending. His political enemies would have torn him apart. And then everything changed. The detectives went to re-interview Annie Winter the next day. They needed her to confirm her statement about the afternoon gunshot. But the woman they met was not the same person. The frantic, tearful housekeeper was gone. In her place was a woman with cold, empty eyes. She sat rigidly in her chair, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. Before the police could ask their first question, one of Hitler's aides, Rudolf Hess, stepped in. He explained that he'd had a private conversation with Frau Winter. Just a friendly chat, he assured them, to help her clarify a few things. The stress of the situation had confused her, he said. The detectives knew what this was, witness tampering in its most blatant form. They proceeded with the interview, but they already knew what they would hear. They asked her again about the gunshot. Annie Winter looked them straight in the eye and lied. She had been mistaken, she said. The sound she heard wasn't in the afternoon. She remembered it now, with perfect clarity. It was late, very late Friday night, long after Herr Hitler had left the city. She was so sorry for the confusion. The shock had muddled her memory. It was a perfect reversal, a clean cut. With one conversation, The party had surgically removed the single most dangerous piece of evidence against their leader. Annie Winter's new testimony aligned perfectly with Hitler's alibi. The official story was now set in stone. Adolf Hitler was on his way to a political rally when his beloved niece tragically took her own life. His alibi was perfect. But the investigators were left with one chilling question that would echo through the years. If your alibi is ironclad, why do you need to threaten a witness to make it true? The body of a murder victim is the most important piece of evidence. It's the one witness that can't be intimidated, can't be bribed, and cannot lie. But Geli Raubal's autopsy report was classified, hidden, and then it vanished. Decades later, rumors of its contents still haunt historians, because Geli Raubal's body had a story to tell, and it was not a story of suicide. The Munich city morgue in 1931 was a cold, sterile place. White tiles, steel tables, the sharp scent of disinfectant that never quite covered the smell of death. On a slab lay the body of the 23-year-old woman who had, just hours before, been the center of Adolf Hitler's world. Now, she was simply evidence. Case number 714. The man tasked with uncovering her secrets was Dr. Johann Schutz, a professional and a man of science. But this was no ordinary case. The air in the autopsy theater was thick not just with formaldehyde, but with pressure. Even before he made the first incision, Schutz knew he wasn't alone. The shadows in the corner weren't just shadows. They were party officials, men in dark suits, watching his every move, their faces unreadable, their silence a threat. The official police report, hastily written at the apartment, suggested a simple narrative. A young woman, despondent over a lover's quarrel, takes her own life. A single gunshot to the heart. Tragic, but straightforward. Dr. Schutz picked up his instruments. The truth is rarely so simple. He began with the wound. It was small, precise. A single entry point from a 6.35 millimeter pistol. Hitler's pistol. But something was immediately wrong. The bullet hadn't struck the heart. It had entered the chest at an upward angle, piercing a lung. Think about what that means. A shot to the heart is a bid for instant oblivion. A shot to the lung is slow, agonizing. You don't die instantly. You drown in your own blood. It can take minutes, minutes of terror, pain, and regret. It's a deeply unusual way to commit suicide. It suggests hesitation, or it suggests the shot was inflicted by someone else. Dr. Schutz made a note. The official story was already cracking. Next, her face. Geli was known for her beauty, her vibrant smile, but on the cold steel table, her face told a different story, a story of violence. Her nose was broken. The injury was fresh, the bruising stark against her pale skin. This wasn't an injury from a fall after being shot. This was from a punch, a powerful, direct blow. The neighbors had heard screaming, a violent argument. Now, the silent witness on the table was confirming their testimony. There had been a fight, a physical one. The official image of a tragic suicide was shattering with every observation the doctor made. As he documented the fracture, he could feel the eyes of the party men burning into his back. They knew what he was finding, and they knew it could not see the light of day. The bullet's trajectory was the next problem. The angle was awkward. For a right-handed person like Geli to shoot herself this way, she would have to hold the gun in a contorted, unnatural position. Possible, perhaps, but highly improbable. It was far more consistent with a shot fired by someone else standing a few feet away. The doctor worked methodically, his hand steady despite the chilling implications. A slow, painful wound, a broken nose, a strange bullet angle. It didn't add up. This wasn't suicide. When the autopsy was finished, Dr. Schutz began his preliminary report. Every word was a potential landmine. He was a man of science, sworn to the facts. The men in the room were men of power, sworn to protect their leader. Before his ink was dry, they stepped forward. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, was among them. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. The report was handed over. The original notes, the photographs, everything was confiscated. It became property of the Nazi Party, not the Munich police. The official cause of death would be listed as suicide. Case closed. The truth was packaged, sealed, and buried before it could draw a single breath. It should have ended there. Another secret swallowed by a political machine growing more efficient by the day. But they made one mistake. They underestimated one man's conscience. In that autopsy room was a junior doctor, an assistant, a young man nobody noticed. He saw what Dr. Schutz saw, the broken bone, the meaning of the bullet's path. And he saw something else being done. A routine procedure in any suspected firearm suicide. A test for gunshot residue on the hands of the deceased. That night, the young doctor couldn't sleep. The image of Geli on the table, the quiet menace of the party officials, the blatant suppression of the truth, it was too much. He made a choice, a dangerous one that could end his career or his life. He picked up the telephone and called the editor of a newspaper, not just any newspaper, but the Münchner Post, an anti-Nazi publication, one of the few opposition voices left in the city. The next day, a small article appeared. It was buried in the middle pages, but its contents were explosive. It didn't have the full autopsy report, but it had the one detail that mattered most, the one detail the party fixers had overlooked. According to the anonymous source from the coroner's office, Geli Raubal's hands had been tested for powder burns, the telltale residue left behind when a gun is fired. The results were negative. Her hands were clean. She had not pulled the trigger. A broken nose, a slow, painful wound, and no gunshot residue. This was no longer suspicious. It was damning. It was the foundation for a murder charge. You would think this would be the end of Adolf Hitler's political career, an open and shut case. But Munich, in 1931, was a city on a knife's edge. The police were underfunded and politically compromised. The justice system was weak, and Hitler's party was an army of fanatics, ready to riot, threaten, and silence anyone who spoke out. The pro-Nazi press dismissed the story as a malicious lie. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. The editor of the Münchner Post was targeted. The truth wasn't just buried, it was attacked. And in the chaos, the central terrifying question was lost. If Geli didn't pull the trigger, who did? The official story was beginning to crack, but a crack isn't a confession. A broken nose and a strange bullet wound were suspicious, but they weren't proof. For the Munich police, the case was turning into a political minefield. They had a body and a powerful suspect, but they had no clear reason why. They were missing the one thing every investigation needs: a motive. They would find it in Geli Raubal's room, not in plain sight, not in a neatly typed note left on a pillow. They would find it hidden away, a secret meant for only one other person to see. Investigators found a half-finished letter on her writing desk. It wasn't a suicide note, it was a love letter detailing her plans to escape to Vienna and start a new life with another man. It was a confession of hope, and in the hands of the man who controlled her, it was a death sentence. The room itself felt wrong. It was too tidy, too composed for the scene of a violent, emotional end. Party officials had already been through it, smoothing the bed sheets, arranging the books. They were curating a memory, building the set for a tragedy of their own design. But Detective Georg Sauer wasn't interested in their story. He looked for the details they missed. The things they didn't know were important. He moved methodically, running his fingers along the spines of her books, mostly poetry and opera librettos. He opened her wardrobe, dresses for the theater, simple clothes for home, a life of curated appearances. Nothing seemed out of place until he came to her writing desk. The official report would mention only a few personal effects, but Sauer saw more. He saw the inkwell still open, a pen resting beside a sheet of paper as if she had just been interrupted. He picked up the paper. The handwriting was elegant but rushed. The ink was smeared in one corner, perhaps by a tear or a hand brushing against it in haste. The letter began, "My dearest," and was addressed to a man in Vienna, her music teacher, the one she had spoken of with such life in her eyes, the one who represented everything her uncle was not: freedom, art, a future she could choose for herself. The letter was a torrent of emotion. It spoke of her excitement, her plans to take the train, the lessons she had already scheduled. She wrote about the songs she wanted to sing. She described the air in Vienna, how it felt different, how it tasted of possibility. For the detectives reading it over Sauer's shoulder, a picture began to form. This wasn't the voice of a woman in despair. This was the voice of a prisoner about to break free. Then came the words that changed everything, the words that provided the motive they had been searching for. She wrote about leaving Munich, about finally escaping the gilded cage her uncle had built for her. And then she wrote a name for her jailer. "I must get away from the monster." The monster, not Uncle Alf, not the beloved Führer of a rising political party. The monster. Imagine the silence in that room as the detectives read that single damning word. It reframed every smile in every photograph, every public appearance, every gift he had ever given her. These weren't acts of affection. They were acts of possession. The letter confirmed their deepest suspicions. Geli was leaving him, and for another man. For someone like Adolf Hitler, a man consumed by jealousy and a pathological need for control, this was the ultimate betrayal, an act of rebellion he could not tolerate. The argument the neighbors heard suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was the final explosive confrontation between a woman fighting for her life and a man who believed he owned it. A confrontation that ended with a broken nose and then a bullet. Then Detective Sauer knew he was holding the key to the entire case. This letter was explosive. It would blow the official suicide story to pieces. He carefully folded the paper and placed it in an evidence envelope. This, he thought, would go directly to the district attorney. The Nazi Party could not spin its way out of this. He was wrong. Word of the letter traveled fast, faster than police procedure. Before the evidence could be logged at the station, 2 men from the Brown house arrived at the apartment. They weren't police. They were party officials in sharp suits, their faces grim and unreadable. They moved with an authority that had nothing to do with the law. They asked to speak with the lead detective. Their politeness was a threat. One of them, a man high in the party's legal department, explained the situation calmly. "This is a tragic family matter," he said. "The Führer is devastated. Any personal effects, especially letters, should be returned to the family immediately to avoid any further pain." Sauer stood his ground, explaining that the letter was evidence in an official investigation. The man simply smiled. It was a smile without warmth or humor, the smile of a man who knew the rules didn't apply to him. "Detective," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "this is a request from the highest levels. I'm sure you understand the need for discretion. The police had a suspect, they had a motive, they had evidence of a cover-up. All they needed was for one man to sign a single piece of paper, a warrant. But that man, the Bavarian Minister of Justice, was about to be caught between the law and the Nazi Party. The investigation into the death of Geli Raubal had reached a critical point. The lead detective, a man named Sauer, had painstakingly assembled a case. Each piece of evidence pointed away from suicide and toward something far more sinister. Sauer had seen enough in his career to recognize a cover-up, and this one was blatant. Now, he walked the marble halls of the Munich Palace of Justice, a fortress of law and order. He carried a file under his arm. Inside was a story of obsession, control, and a final violent argument. It was a story that could end the political career of Adolf Hitler. The Minister of Justice was a man named Franz Gürtner. He was a conservative, a nationalist, a man who believed in a strong Germany, but he was also a jurist, a man who had sworn an oath to the law. He sat behind a large, imposing oak desk as Chief Inspector Sauer laid out the case. Sauer spoke calmly, methodically. He didn't present theories. He presented facts. First, the scene itself. The door was locked from the inside, yes, but party officials were inside the apartment for hours before the police were ever called. Rudolf Hess, the party's lawyer, Hitler's personal photographer, they had control of the scene. They had time to arrange things, to remove anything inconvenient. Gürtner listened, his face a mask of neutrality. Sauer continued. The testimonies were conflicting. The housekeeper's story about when she last saw Geli alive kept changing. Neighbors heard a woman's screams, then a man's furious shouting long after Hitler claimed he had already left for Hamburg. Hitler's own alibi was a mess of contradictions, a frantic scramble to place himself miles away at the moment of death. His theatrical, almost hysterical grief seemed hollow. to the seasoned detectives. Then came the physical evidence, the secret autopsy report that Sauer had managed to see before it was buried. Geli Raubal had a broken nose, an injury difficult to explain in a simple suicide, and the bullet hadn't struck her heart for an instant death. It had pierced her lung, a slow, agonizing way to die, an unlikely choice for someone seeking a quick end. The angle of the wound itself was questionable. Could a person even hold a pistol that way to their own chest? Gertner steepled his fingers. He had not interrupted once. Finally, Sauer produced a copy of the letter found in Geli's room. Her own words explained everything. Her excitement for Vienna, her plans to meet a music teacher she seemed to love, her desperation to escape the man she called the monster. There it was, the motive, rage, jealousy, the possessive fury of a man about to lose his most prized possession. She wasn't just his niece, she was his property, and she was about to escape. Sauer finished his presentation. He looked the Minister of Justice in the eye. "Herr Minister," he said, his voice steady, "we have reason to believe Geli Raubal did not take her own life. We request a warrant to bring in Adolf Hitler for questioning, on suspicion of murder." The room was silent. To accuse the leader of Germany's fastest-growing political movement of murder was more than a legal action. It was a political earthquake. Gertner stared at the file on his desk. The case was strong, suspicious at the very least. He was a man of the law, and the law demanded an investigation no matter the suspect. He nodded slowly. "The evidence you present is disturbing, Inspector. Deeply disturbing." For a moment, it seemed justice might prevail, that the system would work, that a single life mattered more than political power. And then the telephone on Gertner's desk rang. The sound shattered the tension. Gertner picked it up. He listened. His expression changed. The calculated neutrality vanished, replaced by a deep, weary concern. He said little, a yes, a but, and "I understand." He put the receiver down. He didn't look at Sauer. He looked out the window, at the city of Munich spread below. The call was from a powerful political ally. The message was not a suggestion. It was a warning. The man on the other end of the line didn't care about a dead girl or a broken nose. He cared about order. He told Gertner to imagine what would happen if news broke that Hitler, the hero to millions of desperate Germans, was arrested for murder. The brown shirts would not stand by. There would be riots in the streets, pitched battles with the police. The fragile Weimar government, already teetering on the brink, would be shattered. The call wasn't about justice for Geli Raubal. It was about the survival of the state. The threat was no longer about a political scandal. It was about civil war. Franz Gertner turned back from the window. The man of the law was gone. In his place was a politician, a pragmatist. He was no longer weighing evidence. He was weighing consequences. The life of one young woman against the potential chaos of a nation. It was the cold, brutal calculus of power. One inconvenient death, one buried truth, in exchange for public peace. At least, that was the argument. The file on Geli Raubal lay on his desk, a testament to a crime and a silent plea for justice. The inspector waited for his answer. The entire investigation, the The truth of what happened in that locked room now rested on this one man, a man forced to decide between the law he served and the nation he feared would burn. The Minister of Justice, Franz Gürtner, held the fate of Adolf Hitler in his hands. The file on his desk was political dynamite, a request for a murder warrant against the leader of Germany's fastest-growing political party. To sign it would be to ignite a firestorm. To refuse would be to bury a potential crime. The pressure from the Nazi Party was immense. The pressure from the law was absolute. As Gürtner weighed his options, the case seemed destined to stall, crushed under the weight of political convenience. But just when the investigation seemed fated to be buried, a new witness came forward, and they brought with them the most explosive rumor of all. Geli Raubal was pregnant. If this was true, it changed everything. The motive was no longer a crime of passion, a possessive uncle snapping in a fit of rage. It was something far more calculated, far more sinister. The story broke in the pages of the Münchner Post, a newspaper openly hostile to the Nazis, and one of the few journalistic voices left in the city that dared to challenge Hitler. The article was sensational. It cited an anonymous source, described only as a close confidant of Geli's. According to this friend, Geli had been terrified. She had missed her monthly cycle and confided her deepest fear, that she was carrying her uncle's child. The news hit Munich like a shock wave. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was in print. For Adolf Hitler, this was a potential catastrophe. His entire political identity was built on a carefully constructed myth. He was the lonely leader, the man who sacrificed personal happiness for the good of the nation. He was, in his own words, married to Germany. He had no time for a wife, no room for a family. He was above the petty desires of ordinary men. This image of chastity and self-denial was a powerful tool, making him seem almost messianic to his followers. A child, especially a child with his own niece, wouldn't just shatter this image. It would obliterate it. It would expose him as a hypocrite, a fraud, and a deviant. In the fragile political landscape of 1931, such a scandal wouldn't just damage him. It could destroy him. For the detectives, the rumor was the key that could unlock the entire mystery. Suddenly, the final argument between Geli and Hitler made a terrifying new kind of sense. Geli wasn't just fighting for her freedom to go to Vienna. She was fighting for her life, and the life of her unborn child. Perhaps she was threatening to expose him, to tell the world their secret. His violent refusal to let her leave wasn't just about control anymore. It was about containment. He had to silence her, whatever the cost. The broken nose, the signs of a struggle. It all pointed to a final, desperate confrontation. A confrontation that ended with a single gunshot. But proving it was another matter entirely. The Nazi Party did not sit idle. Their propaganda machine, under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, roared to life. Their own newspapers, like the Völkischer Beobachter, launched a vicious counterattack, branding the Münchner Post, a purveyor of lies, part of a Jewish conspiracy to smear the Führer. The journalist who wrote the story was publicly vilified, his life threatened. The anonymous friend, the source of the story, vanished. Whether she was intimidated into silence or simply went into hiding, no one knew. She was gone. The police had a powerful motive, but no witness to back it up. They had a theory, but no hard evidence. The body had been cremated. Any medical proof of a pregnancy was now ash. The investigation hit a wall of silence and fear. The official narrative of a tragic suicide was being cemented in place by brute force. But then a new thought began to form in the minds of the investigators, a thought even darker than the last. They were looking at the problem all wrong. They assumed the motive was to prevent the scandal of a birth. But what if the motive was to cover up a death that had already occurred, accidentally? This led them to a chilling new theory: illegal abortion. In 1931 Germany, abortion was a crime, a dangerous back alley procedure. What if Hitler, faced with a politically ruinous pregnancy, had forced Geli into one? What if something had gone horribly wrong? A botched procedure, a fatal hemorrhage. In this scenario, Hitler wasn't just facing a scandal. He was facing a felony charge for arranging an illegal act that resulted in death. The panic, the immediate lockdown of the apartment, the manipulation of the crime scene, it all made sense. The suicide was no longer the crime. The suicide was the cover-up. It was a story invented on the spot to hide a far messier, more complicated truth. A truth that involved not one crime, but two. The gunshot was not an act of murder in a moment of rage. It was a cold, calculated piece of stagecraft, a way to create a new, simpler narrative that erased the illegal abortion from the record. It was a brutal but brilliant solution. It turned a potential manslaughter charge and a career-ending scandal into a personal tragedy that could even be used to generate public sympathy for the grieving uncle. Think about the possibilities laid out before the investigators. A crime of passion, where a jealous man kills the woman he can't possess. A political assassination, where a leader silences a threat to his ambition. Or this third option, a botched abortion, covered up by a staged suicide. Which theory do you find more believable? Each one reveals a different facet of the man at the center of the storm. Each path leads to a different kind of monster. The detectives were now lost in a hall of mirrors, where every fact could be interpreted in multiple ways. The truth about what happened in that locked room on Prinzregentenplatz seemed to slip further away with every new theory. But the pregnancy rumor, whether true or not, had changed the foundation of the case. It forced everyone to ask a question they had so far avoided. A question that went beyond the crime itself and into the very heart of the relationship between uncle and niece. Could the entire story of a possessive guardian have been a cover for an even darker secret? What if Hitler didn't pull the trigger? What if he wasn't even in the room? A darker theory points to his most loyal follower, Heinrich Himmler, and his motive wasn't to protect Hitler, but to control him forever. The investigation into Geli Raubal's death usually focuses on two possibilities: a tragic suicide born of despair, or a murder committed in a fit of rage by her obsessive uncle, Adolf Hitler. But there is a third door, and behind it stands a man who rarely stepped into the spotlight, a man who preferred the shadows. His name was Heinrich Himmler. To the public, in 1931, he was a minor figure, a former chicken farmer, quiet, meticulous, bespectacled. He looked more like a provincial school teacher than a man who would one day command armies of death. But within the Nazi Party, his role was already clear. He was the party's bookkeeper, not of money, but of secrets. He collected debts and filed away weaknesses. Every rumor, every indiscretion, every private shame was an asset to be cataloged and stored. He was the man you called when a problem couldn't be solved with speeches or street brawls. He was the cleaner. The theory begins with a simple premise. Himmler understood, perhaps better than Hitler himself, the political danger Geli represented. She wasn't just a niece, she was a liability, a beautiful, vivacious, and defiant young woman who knew too much. She knew about Hitler's violent tempers, his strange obsessions. She had seen the man behind the public mask, and she was planning to leave, to go to Vienna, to another man, to a life where she might talk. And then there was the most catastrophic rumor of all, the pregnancy. For Hitler, the man building an image of a chaste savior married only to Germany, a child out of wedlock with his own niece would be more than a scandal. It would be political annihilation. The first version of this theory is one of grim loyalty. Himmler learns of the crisis. Perhaps Hitler calls him in a panic after their final argument. Or perhaps Himmler's own informants tell him the Geli problem is about to explode. He sees the threat to the movement, to his Führer, and he acts decisively, ruthlessly. He, or one of his trusted men, goes to the apartment on Prinzregentenplatz. The goal is simple: silence her, permanently. A single gunshot, a carefully placed pistol, a locked door. The problem is solved. The party is safe. But that explanation seems too simple for a man like Himmler. It overlooks his defining trait, a cold, reptilian ambition. This leads to a second, far more disturbing version of the story, one where Himmler didn't just solve a problem for Hitler. He created a bond, a chain forged in silence and sealed with a secret. A shared crime is the strongest form of loyalty. It's a guarantee, a permanent piece of leverage. In this scenario, Himmler's actions aren't about protecting his leader, they are about owning him. Imagine the scene. Hitler is miles away, his alibi secure. Himmler's agent gets into the apartment. Perhaps Geli lets him in, thinking he's a messenger. The deed is done. The first call Himmler makes is to Hitler. He doesn't say, "I've solved a problem for you." He says, "We have a problem, and I am taking care of it." From that moment on, Hitler is no longer just his leader, he is his accomplice. He is implicated in the cover-up, one managed entirely by Himmler. Every lie told to the police, every piece of evidence cleaned from the scene, every witness intimidated into silence. All of it orchestrated by the quiet man in the glasses. From that day forward, their relationship was fundamentally altered. It was no longer Führer and subordinate. It was a partnership built on a shared, unspoken horror. Hitler could scream at his generals. He could command the fanatical loyalty of millions. But he could never escape the quiet, knowing gaze of the one man who knew the truth of what happened in that apartment. The one man who cleaned up the blood. This theory explains so much. Himmler's meteoric rise to power, the reason Hitler gave him control of the SS, the Gestapo, the entire internal security apparatus of the Third Reich. He wasn't just rewarding a loyal follower. He was keeping the keeper of his darkest secret closer than anyone else. He was shackled to him. It forces a chilling question. Who is more terrifying, the monster who acts on impulse and rage, or the cold, calculating man who cleans up the monster's messes for his own advantage? One is a beast. The other is a puppeteer. The Geli Raubal affair wasn't just buried. It became a blueprint, a terrible lesson learned in a Munich apartment that taught the Nazi inner circle they were above the law. That truth was malleable. It was whatever they said it was. Himmler learned he could control not just people, but reality itself. And Hitler learned that with the right people cleaning up his messes, he could get away with anything. This private tragedy was the dress rehearsal for a decade of public lies and state-sponsored murder. The mechanism of deceit that would consume a continent was perfected in that one locked room. The official cause of death remained suicide, a young woman's tragic decision. But the question lingers, casting a long, cold shadow over history. Did Adolf Hitler spend the rest of his life as a leader or as a puppet, blackmailed by his own security chief? The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were terrified, but their stories, when pieced together, painted a dark and undeniable picture. The lies were clumsy, desperate, and obvious. And yet, the official verdict came down like a slammed door. Geli Raubal, it was declared, died by her own hand. The truth was not just ignored, it was officially buried. And the man who was the prime suspect was now free to run for chancellor. The telephone on Franz Gürtner's desk was no longer a tool of communication. It had become an instrument of coercion. Each ring was a fresh wave of pressure, a new voice of power reminding him of his duty, not to justice, but to Germany's fragile stability. The calls came from party headquarters, from wealthy industrialists who saw Hitler as a bulwark against communism, from old guard military men who saw a future ally. They didn't speak of murder. They spoke of a necessary conclusion. They spoke of the bigger picture, of national interest, of a scandal the nation could not afford. In his hands, Gürtner held the detective's report. It was a meticulous document of doubt, a timeline that didn't add up, a suicide weapon that felt wrong, a broken nose on a woman who supposedly shot herself, a motive for murder laid bare in a hidden, unfinished letter. Every page screamed for a proper investigation. Every piece of evidence pointed directly at one man, Adolf Hitler. But the voices on the phone were louder than the words on the page. Imagine him there in his oak-paneled office, the weight of a nation's future resting on his shoulders. He was a man of the law, a conservative nationalist who believed in order. But the order he knew was crumbling. In its place was a new, brutal kind of power. To pursue this case meant declaring war on the Nazi Party. It meant political chaos, unleashing forces he could not control. To close it, that meant peace at a price. He picked up his pen. The ink was a deep, definitive black. He paused, looking at the file one last time. Geli Raubal's face, captured in a photograph, looked back at him, a ghost in a manila folder. Then he signed the document. His signature sealed her fate a second time. The official order was drafted. The case into the death of Angela Raubal was closed. The official cause, suicide, brought on by a state of deep depression and unrequited love. The words were clinical, clean, and utterly false. The next morning, party-friendly newspapers printed the official story. It was a tragedy, they said, a story of a sensitive young woman overwhelmed by her affections for her famous uncle. They painted Hitler not as a suspect, but as a victim himself, a grieving guardian shattered by his niece's desperate act. The few independent papers that dared to print the rumors of murder received legal notices within hours. They were sued for libel, their journalists threatened, their finances crippled. The official story was now the only story permitted. For the lead detective, the end came not with a confrontation, but with a quiet official letter delivered by a ministry courier. It spoke of a promotion, a new post as head of a small precinct in a quiet town on the Austrian border, a place where nothing ever happened. He read the words, their meaning perfectly clear between the lines. It wasn't a promotion, it was a burial. He stood in his office and looked at the case file on his desk. A Geli's file, all the interviews, the diagrams, the contradictions, the unsent letter. It was the best police work he had ever done, and it was now useless. He packed it into a cardboard box, sealed it, and placed it in the archives, a monument to a truth that was no longer allowed to exist. The system had worked perfectly. It hadn't just protected a man, it had protected an idea. At this point, whether the final order came from a jealous Hitler in a fit of rage or from a coldly pragmatic Himmler seeking to eliminate a political liability, was a moot point. The cover-up served both masters equally. The machine of the state had been tested, and it had proven its loyalty not to the law, but to the party. But in the cold silence of the city morgue's archive, one man performed a final, secret operation. Dr. Muller, the medical examiner, knew they would come for his files. He knew the party would want his official report, his photos, his notes, to use as definitive proof of their suicide narrative. Late one night, alone among the records of the dead, he pulled Geli Raubal's file. He looked at the photographs he had taken himself. The close-up of the entry wound in the lung, not the heart. The undeniable image of her bruised and broken nose. He removed them. He then removed his own handwritten notes, the ones questioning the angle of the shot and documenting the signs of a struggle. He placed the sanitized official report back in the folder. The rest he made disappear. It was a clerical error that was anything but a desperate act of historical preservation, a crime committed to prevent the complete triumph of a lie. This is how it happens. This is how a democracy begins to die. Not with an explosion, but with a quiet signature on a piece of paper in a dimly lit office. It happens when the institutions designed to find the truth are ordered to bury it instead. When the justice system stops serving the people and starts serving the powerful. The case was closed. The whispers faded. The newspapers moved on. Adolf Hitler was officially exonerated, a man cleared of all suspicion. But the story was far from over. He had faced the abyss. He had stared down a murder charge that would have ended his career, and he had won. How does a man change when he learns he can get away with anything, even murder? Hitler got away with it. The case was closed. The official story was sealed. But he never escaped Geli. He turned her room into a shrine he kept locked. He commissioned portraits of her, turning her face into an icon of private grief. And then, at his photographer's studio, he met a young shop girl who looked hauntingly familiar. Her name was Eva Braun. The scandal was buried, but the man was broken, or so it seemed. In the days following Geli Raubal's death, Adolf Hitler fled Munich for a quiet villa on the shores of Lake Tegernsee, a refuge for the party elite. He was accompanied by his most loyal followers, including Joseph Goebbels, the party's master of propaganda and a meticulous diarist, and Goebbels watched his Führer fall apart. He wrote in his journal that Hitler was in a state of complete collapse. He refused to eat. For days he paced the villa, staring out at the placid water of the lake, a man hollowed out by grief. He spoke of ending his own life. He declared his political career was over. "My life has lost its purpose," he told his inner circle. His sorrow was a performance of epic proportions, a storm of emotion that consumed everyone around him. But was it real, or was this something else entirely? A calculated, theatrical display from a man who understood the power of narrative. He was crafting a new story in real time, the story of a tragic leader who sacrificed personal happiness for his nation, a man now scarred by a profound and noble loss. The story worked. His followers saw not a potential suspect, but a martyr. They rallied around him, their loyalty hardened by his apparent suffering. After a week of self-imposed exile, he returned to Munich. He was different. The wild grief was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He went back to the apartment on Prinzregentenplatz. He went to Geli's room, and he gave an order. Nothing was to be touched. The room became a mausoleum. Her clothes remained in the wardrobe. Her sheet music stayed on the piano. The faint scent of her perfume was said to linger in the air. Her door was kept locked, and only Hitler had the key. Every year, on her birthday and the anniversary of her death, he would fill the room with fresh white flowers. It was a shrine to a ghost, a permanent reminder of the woman he had controlled and lost. But a memory wasn't enough. He needed to see her face. He commissioned artists and sculptors, ordering them to create busts and portraits of Geli, not as she was, but as he wanted to remember her, idealized, angelic, a tragic muse, frozen in time. These images began to fill his private residences, her sculpted face watching him from every corner. He was surrounding himself with a version of Geli he could finally control completely, a Geli who could never talk back, never defy him, never try to leave. The party, however, was growing. His image was more important than ever, and for that he needed photographs. His official photographer was Heinrich Hoffmann, whose Munich studio was the factory for the Führer's public persona. The place smelled of developing chemicals and flash powder, a world of staged smiles and heroic poses. And it was there he saw her, a 17-year-old shop assistant and model named Eva Braun. One evening, Hitler walked into the studio with Hoffmann. Eva was on a ladder, putting something away on a high shelf. She was athletic, with light brown hair and blue eyes. She was to an almost chilling degree the same physical type as Geli. According to Hoffmann's account, Hitler stopped and stared. He asked, "Who is this pretty Munich child?" His phrase in German was "schönes Münchner Kindl," paternal, condescending, and immediately possessive. Eva was starstruck. Here was the famous Adolf Hitler, the man whose picture she developed every day, looking at her. Unlike Geli, who had a fierce, independent spirit, Eva was quiet, unassuming, and deeply impressed by his power. She was a blank slate. He saw the perfect replacement. The relationship began in secret. He had learned his lesson. Geli's semi-public role as his niece had given her a platform, a voice, a degree of freedom. That was a mistake he would not repeat. Eva Braun was to be a ghost in his life, existing only in the shadows. This became brutally clear at the Berghof, his sprawling mountain retreat in the Alps. It was his sanctuary, a place to entertain world leaders and project an image of power. For Eva, it was the perfected, gilded cage. When official guests arrived, Eva was under strict orders to stay in her room. She was often forced to use a back staircase to avoid being seen by anyone of importance. She was the leader's secret mistress, a humiliating, invisible existence. The isolation was crushing. In 1932, after nearly a year of this secret life, Eva grew desperate. He would ignore her for weeks at a time, consumed by politics. She felt like a forgotten object. So she took her father's pistol, aimed it at her own neck, and pulled the trigger. She missed any vital arteries, but the message was clear. It was a cry for help. For Hitler, it was a terrifying echo of the past. Another young woman, another gunshot, another potential career-ending scandal. He panicked. He rushed to her side, suddenly attentive, showering her with affection. He understood the threat. He couldn't afford another Geli Raubal affair. His solution wasn't freedom, but a different kind of control. He reinforced her behavior. He taught her that only a desperate act would guarantee his attention. 3 years later, in 1935, it happened again. He was neglecting her once more. She wrote a final dramatic entry in her diary and swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. Again, she was discovered just in time. And again, Hitler's reaction was a mix of political fear and manipulative charm. He bought her a villa, he gave her a dog, he brought her more formally into his private life at the Berghof. The cage got bigger, the bars were now made of gold, but it was still a cage. He hadn't found a new love. He had found a safer version of the old one, an upgrade, a Geli 2.0, with the rebellious code removed. He had found a woman so desperate for his affection that she would accept total invisibility as the price, a woman who would never dream of escaping to Vienna. Did Hitler ever truly love any of these women? Or were they just objects to him, possessions to be curated, controlled, and locked away, just like the art he stole and the secrets he kept? He had built a prison for Eva Braun, just as he had for Geli. But this time, the walls were higher, the locks stronger. He had perfected the system. Would the ending be any different? The Geli Raubal cover-up wasn't just about hiding a murder. It was a rehearsal, a dark, private experiment where Adolf Hitler and his inner circle learned to manipulate the press, intimidate justice, and sell a monstrous lie to the public. What happened in that Munich apartment in 1931 wasn't an end. It was the beginning of a method, a 4-step blueprint for turning truth into a weapon. Step 1. Control the scene. Remember Prinzregentenplatz 16, the locked door. The body found not by the police, but by party loyalists. Rudolf Hess, the party lawyer, the inner circle. They were inside first, They moved things. They coached the housekeeper. They controlled the physical space, turning a crime scene into a stage set before investigators even arrived. They built the walls of the official story on site. Less than 2 years later, on a cold February night in Berlin, Germany would see this tactic again, magnified 1,000 times over. Flames devoured the Reichstag, the very symbol of German democracy. The night sky glowed orange. Glass shattered. Panic flooded the streets. And through the smoke, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring arrived almost immediately. They weren't there to fight the fire. They were there to feed the flames of conspiracy. Their faces, lit by the blaze, delivered a pre-packaged lie, a communist plot, an attack on the nation. The evidence? There was none. It didn't matter. They controlled the scene. They controlled the narrative from the first moment. The Reichstag fire was Prinzregentenplatz 16, written in fire across the capital. The lesson learned in Geli's silent room was now screaming from the heart of the government. Step 2. Neutralize the justice system. The Munich police had a strong case, a broken nose, a strange bullet trajectory, conflicting alibis, a powerful motive in a hidden letter. They had enough to bring the leader of the Nazi Party in for questioning on suspicion of murder. Their investigation was professional, thorough, and dangerous. But it all stopped at the desk of the Minister of Justice, Franz Gürtner. He held the file. He saw the inconsistencies, the evidence of a cover-up, and he made a choice not for justice, but for political expediency. He declared the evidence insufficient and ordered the case closed. One man, in one office, strangled the truth to protect a political asset. And what happened to Minister Gürtner? He didn't fade into obscurity. When Hitler seized power, Franz Gürtner remained the Minister of Justice. The man who buried the Geli Raubal investigation went on to preside over the total perversion of the German legal system. He didn't just close one case file, he closed the book on German justice itself. He signed off on laws that allowed for arrest without cause. He oversaw the creation of the infamous People's Court, a political theater where death sentences were a foregone conclusion. The system wasn't broken, it was redesigned. The logic was perfected. The law does not exist to find the truth. It exists to serve the will of the Führer. The same logic that saved one man from a murder charge would soon condemn millions without a trial. Step 3. Weaponize the media and create a myth. After Geli's death, the Nazi press didn't just deny a murder. They created a work of fiction, a beautiful, tragic romance. Geli died of a broken heart, they claimed, unable to bear her unrequited love for her brilliant uncle. He was devastated, a man of sorrows, forever wounded by this pure feminine spirit. Newspapers that dared to print the truth about the arguments, the broken nose, the pregnancy rumors, were sued into oblivion. The party didn't just silence dissent. They replaced it with a powerful, emotionally manipulative myth. This became a central pillar of the Third Reich. Joseph Goebbels understood the principle perfectly. A lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. The myth of Geli's tragic love was a test run. Soon, the myths would become grander. The myth that Germany was stabbed in the back in World War I. The myth that a global Jewish conspiracy was destroying the nation from within. The myth that brutal purges were necessary to cleanse the country of traitors. In Munich, Hitler turned a potential victim into a saint to protect his own image. On the national stage, he and Goebbels would turn an entire nation of victims into aggressors, convinced of their own righteousness, fueled by a mythology of lies, slander, and hate. The technique was the same, simply scaled up from a single apartment to an entire nation. Which brings us to step 4, the final brutal act of rewriting history, the night of the long knives. 1934. Hitler decided his old comrades in the SA, the stormtroopers who helped him rise, were now a threat. Over one weekend, hundreds were executed without trial. Think of Gregor Strasser, once Hitler's rival for the soul of the party. He was arrested and taken to a prison in Berlin. They didn't give him a trial. They gave him a cell. An SS officer shot him through the bars. He didn't die instantly. He bled out alone on a concrete floor. His murder, and hundreds like it, was presented to the German people as a heroic act, a necessary purge to save the nation from a coup. The murderers were heroes. The victims were traitors. The truth of their lives was erased, replaced by a myth of national salvation. The pattern was identical. Geli Raubal's truth, her desire for freedom, her life, her potential murder, was erased and replaced by the myth of a heartbroken girl. Her identity was sacrificed for his political narrative. Strasser's identity was sacrificed for the same reason. The scale was different. The principle was the same. The lesson was learned. The blueprint was perfected, and Eva Braun was the result. Look at the photographs. The resemblance to Geli is undeniable. The same face shape, the same smile. But Eva was different. She was the corrected version, the final product of the Geli experiment. From the home movies she filmed at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, we see a curated illusion of domestic bliss. Picnics, laughter, dogs playing on the terrace. But she was a ghost, forbidden from appearing at his side in public, forbidden from having any official title. She was a secret, just as the truth about Geli was a secret. She was the ultimate expression of his control. A woman who looked like the one he couldn't break, but who understood the rules of the cage without ever needing to be locked inside. She was living proof that he had learned his lesson. Never again would a woman have the power to defy him. He had perfected the art of possession. This is why the death of one girl in a Munich apartment matters so deeply. It wasn't just a family tragedy or a footnote. It was the origin story of the big lie. It was the crucible where the tools of tyranny were forged. The private deception became the model for public policy. The lies used to cover one body would soon be used to justify covering a continent with them. They buried her truth under a mountain of propaganda, political pressure, and fear. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Does a politician's private morality matter? Does the way a person wields power over one individual in secret tell us anything about how they will wield power over millions in public? If the truth about one death could be buried so easily, what hope was there for the millions to come? No court ever charged Adolf Hitler with the murder of his niece. The official record, the one you can find in the archives of Munich, still reads suicide. The evidence you've seen, the facts that scream a different story, have been dismissed, ignored, and suppressed for almost a century. The case is closed, the files are sealed. But the story is not over. Now, you are the jury. History isn't always written in courtrooms or by judges. It's often written by those with the power to silence the truth. In the autumn of 1931, Minister of Justice Franz Gürtner made a decision. He looked at the evidence presented by his own detectives, he saw the contradictions, he knew the political stakes, and he chose the path of least resistance, declaring the case closed due to insufficient evidence. It was a legal maneuver, a political necessity. It was the moment a door was slammed shut on the truth. But doors can be unlocked. Let's look at the evidence one last time. Let's assemble the case against the official story. Let's present the closing argument that was never heard in a court of law. First, the crime scene itself. Prinzregentenplatz 16, a luxury apartment that became a fortress of secrets. The police were not the first to arrive. Party officials were. Rudolf Hess, the party lawyer, men loyal not to the law of Germany, but to the will of Adolf Hitler. They were inside Geli's room before the first detective ever stepped through the door. They had time. Time to arrange the scene, time to coordinate their stories, time to ensure that whatever the police found, it would be what they wanted them to find. The scene was described as strangely sterile. A woman lay dead, but the narrative was already alive and controlled. Then there is the body of Geli Raubal, the silent witness that tells the most damning story. The official report mentions a single gunshot wound to the lung, a strange choice for suicide. It is not quick, it is not certain, it is agonizing. It suggests hesitation, or perhaps a struggle, but it's what the sanitized report leaves out that truly matters. The broken nose, confirmed by the medical examiner in his initial private findings. A broken nose is not a symptom of suicide. It is the classic, brutal signature of a violent confrontation, a fist, a blow, a fight for one's life. And what of the gunshot itself? There was no gunpowder residue found on Geli's hands. In 1931, forensic science was young, but this was a basic test. If you fire a pistol, especially at close range, the powder marks your skin. Her hands were clean. Someone else pulled the trigger. Next, we have the witnesses, a chorus of fear and contradiction. Neighbors heard a furious argument. They heard shouting, a woman's desperate pleas, a man's rage. Then, a sound like a gunshot. But their timelines, when officially recorded, became murky, uncertain. The housekeeper, Annie Winter, was fiercely loyal to Hitler. Her story shifted to protect him, to place him far away from the apartment when the shot was fired. And what of Hitler himself? He rushed back to Munich not as a grieving uncle, but as a performer. His grief was described as theatrical, over the top, a spectacle for his inner circle. He wept. He threatened to end his own life. He declared he could never love another. It was a performance designed to elicit sympathy, to cast himself as the victim, not the suspect. Finally, the most powerful piece of evidence, motive. The official story needed a motive for suicide. They settled on unrequited love. A young woman, heartbroken that her uncle did not return her affections. But we know this was a lie. We have seen her letter, the unsent letter hidden in her room. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a declaration of independence. A love letter to another man, her music teacher in Vienna. It was a ticket to freedom. She wasn't planning to die. She was planning to live. Hitler found out. He discovered her plan to escape, to leave him for someone else. For a man defined by his need for absolute control, this was the ultimate betrayal. She was not just his niece, she was his possession. And she was about to escape her cage, taking with her the secrets of his private life. And if that wasn't enough, consider the rumor that haunted the case from the very beginning, the whispers that Geli was pregnant. A pregnancy would have been more than a scandal. It would have been the complete destruction of the image he had so carefully crafted. The chaste leader, married only to Germany. A child would have been a political catastrophe. And for Adolf Hitler, there was no line between the political and the personal. A threat to one was a threat to both. So, who killed Geli Raubal? The evidence points to 3 possibilities, and none of them absolve her uncle. Possibility 1, a crime of passion. Hitler confronts her about the letter, about Vienna. The argument escalates. He strikes her, breaking her nose. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he grabs his own pistol and shoots her. Then, panic. The party machine kicks in to clean up the mess and create the suicide story. Possibility 2, a cold-blooded calculation. This theory is perhaps even more disturbing. Maybe it wasn't Hitler who pulled the trigger, but one of his loyal executioners. Someone like Heinrich Himmler. Himmler, the ultimate fixer, could have seen Geli as a security risk, a liability who knew too much and was about to flee. In this scenario, her death was not a crime of passion, but a political assassination, disguised as a suicide to protect the future of the Nazi Party. And possibility 3. The official story is true, but only in the most twisted sense. Perhaps Geli did pull the trigger herself, but if she did, it was not an act of free will. It was the final desperate act of a prisoner, a young woman so psychologically broken, so completely trapped by her uncle's suffocating control that death seemed like the only way out. If she committed suicide, it was a death caused by Adolf Hitler. He loaded the gun, even if he didn't pull the trigger. We will never know for sure. The men who knew the truth took that secret to their graves. The physical evidence is long gone. The official record will forever read suicide. But the circumstantial case is overwhelming. The pattern of behavior, the motive, the cover-up, it all points in one direction. This is the chilling legacy of Geli Raubal's death. It's not just about a single murder. It's about what Hitler learned from it. He learned that he could control the narrative. He learned that the loyalty of his followers was absolute. He learned that the institutions of the state could be bent to his will. He learned that with enough power and ruthlessness, you can get away with anything. You can get away with murder. The cover-up of Geli's death was not an isolated incident. It was the blueprint. It was a dress rehearsal for the lies and deceptions that would define his entire regime. So, the verdict of history remains unwritten, and now the question is passed to you. Based on the evidence, what do you believe happened in that apartment on Prinzregentenplatz? Was it a crime of passion by a jealous tyrant? A cold-blooded political move by his ruthless machine? Or the tragic final act of a desperate captive? The official record is closed, but this conversation is not. What does your conscience and your reason tell you is the truth? The death of one girl in Munich may seem like a footnote in a history of millions of deaths, but it wasn't a footnote. It was the prologue. The secrets of that locked room didn't stay locked. They seeped out, and poisoned the world.